ways that you can access the forecasts. So we're just going to take 30 minutes to share the research that we've done, what that's told us about the future of South Australia, and we've got plenty of time at the end for a Q&A with our forecasters. On that note, the chat should be open. Feel free to drop any questions in there. We've got Sally and Johnny online. They'll be joining us for the Q&A, but they can also write back and moderate. There's Sal during the call, or if you prefer to use the Q&A function, that's there too. But we'll hop straight into it. If you've been to one of these calls before, you know that we like to start with the take-home messages. And the first one is that we're forecasting 400,000 additional South Australians will join the state in the next 25 years. So that's South Australia's share of the 9.2 million people that we forecast will be added to Australia's population over that same period from 2021 to 2046. So the second point is that it's all happening up in Adelaide North. We'll get into that in more detail, but the region's home to growing young families, and it has an ample supply of land to support greenfield growth up in the Adelaide North region, and in particular suburbs like Elizabeth and Gawler, Salisbury. They'll be home to some of the largest growth fronts, accounting for more than for around 40% of South Australia's growth over the next 25 years. Overseas migration remains a really big story, the biggest in town, as we've said there. So while the state receives a relatively small share of the nation's overall total migration from overseas, it remains the most significant driver of population growth in the state. The fourth point, we'll look at this in a bit more detail, is the youth brain drain. It's a long-standing and a cyclical pattern that South Australia loses more people more young people to other states than it actually gains from them. And while that was reversed momentarily during the pandemic, it's certainly back to that traditional pattern. And the fifth point, at the end of the presentation, we're going to be speaking a bit more about the land use research that we undertake in the course of our forecasting cycle. And just the key take-home message is, just because a site is zoned for development, or it's marked for even advertised development for that site, it doesn't mean there's going to be anyone living there anytime soon. And we'll talk through the ways in which we balance demand from population growth with different sources of housing supply later in the presentation. So a brief introduction to ID for those who may not be familiar with us and the work that we do. So ID stands for Informed Decisions. We're a company of demographers, housing analysts, economists, census data experts, and social researchers. We're only a relatively small organisation. There's just over 40 of us, but we've got a very proud 25-year-long history of supporting decision-making, both in local government, where our origins, I guess you could say, were, but also in state government and in the private sector. We work extensively with private providers for education, retailers, developers, and the state government as well. So if you've done any desktop research about a place in Australia, you've probably come across our information, and that's because we maintain a suite of information tools for over 300 councils all across Australia. That represents over 80% of the population, and those tools are accessed by over 100,000 people on average every month. So the tools are typically sponsored by local councils, and they're used as a shared evidence base for planning, for policy, for advocacy and engagement. They provide a very rich and a detailed information about local areas, about the demographics of those places, economics, housing, and as well now the values and the lived experiences of residents. Today we're going to be focusing on the forecasting part of that evidence base, which we make available as a tool to all councils via a tool that we call Forecast ID. Again, if you're new to Forecast ID, it gives you a detailed knowledge of how the population and housing will change in each year of the forecast period for each suburb within your local government area and beyond, but more on that soon. Just so that you can make informed decisions, whether that's around planning or advocating for the needs of your future community. So in today's session, as I said, we're going to be particularly focused on the ways that local government use this tool. And some of you may have joined the sessions that my colleague Sally, who was just on the screen, and Jake have run over the last 3 weeks, where we've been previewing some really great changes that are coming in the forecasting service that we offer for local government. If you did miss those sessions, we'll be sending around a pack after the session this afternoon. We'll include links to the information page and the recording of those sessions if you want to catch up. And Sally and Jake are also going to be in South Australia next week, and there's time that they'll have available if you'd like to catch up and meet with them and have more information about how you can tee that up shortly. But one of the main announcements that we've been making in those sessions is that Forecast ID, the tool for local government, will now be powered by our national forecasting model. So I'll just take a moment to explain that model because it gives us a really neat framework for the research that we're presenting in the webinar today. So the national forecasting model, it's the engine that sits behind all of ID's forecasting services, which includes Forecast ID for local government. So we've got a team of independent specialists. We're the largest team doing this work in Australia independently, and we develop and we maintain these forecasts ourselves in-house. So the process, it starts with a really high-level view of Australia, and we cascade that down, that national view down to different states and territories, down to the regions within those states and territories, and then finally right down to really detailed small area forecasts that give a lot of granular detail for local areas. And then of course it's important that we continually monitor and adapt our assumptions, incorporating new information, whether that's census data, major new policies, changes in big movements in things like overseas migration, or of course disruptive events like the pandemic. Essentially any significant new piece of information that will materially impact the finding of the forecast. So there's a number of benefits to this model, but chief among them is that it creates a consistent and a single source of forecast information, regardless of which part of the country you're looking at and working in. So the forecasts combine that national and state view, that the demand drivers up at the top level, in other words, factors that are influencing population growth. They combine that with our really detailed research into housing supply at the local area level. And in this way, we can actually recognise the interconnections between places so that our forecast can provide the local detail about a place in its regional and its national context. Just before we get into the results, just want to mention for each of these regions, we publish an analysis that lays out in quite a bit of detail our research and makes transparent our assumptions for each of those regions. I really highly recommend these write-ups that we do, just so that you can understand what the thinking behind the number that ultimately lands in your forecasts, and you can interpret and use them appropriately. If you're using the forecast for advocacy or engagement work, these just provide another level of information and I guess colour to those forecasts that you can share with your community. We'll also include links in the pack that we send around later this afternoon. So let's jump straight in and have a look at the forecast now, and we'll start right at the top with our forecast for the nation. So Australia's population has doubled since the early 70s. For anyone that thinks in average annual growth terms, that's 1.4% per annum average annual growth over that period. Over the past 10 years, we've had a relatively high growth rate of between 1.5% and 2%, and that places us among the 5 fastest growing OECD countries. In June 2021, the population was just over 25.5 million people, and our forecast assumed that we'll continue to grow at around 1.1% per annum, increasing our population by 9.2 million people over the next 25 years. So there's only 3 factors at that national level that can affect how the population changes: people being born, people dying, people moving, migration. So slight changes in things like the birth rate, in life expectancy, or in the level of future overseas migration, they can have a significant impact on the population over the forecast period. And what we'll do, rather than go too far into that today, is again, we've got a really detailed piece of analysis that shares all of our thinking and our research into each of those factors. We'll include a link to that right up in the pack we send around today. But there is one big part of that is obviously the big story at the moment, and that's overseas migration. Just to bring in some historical context, Since 2006, that's been the main driver of Australia's population growth, stimulated by federal government policies designed to bolster the tertiary education sector, attract a skilled workforce, and balance the ageing population. We're all familiar with the story of what happened when COVID hit, closed international borders in March 2020, amazing overnight halt in that overseas migration, leading to the first decline in our population since World War I. This year, it's expected to go over 400,000 people, surpassing the previous highs of around 300,000, which was 15 years ago during the GFC. But some of this, we see this as a post-COVID catch-up, and we see that there'll be a correction that comes from next year to a longer-term average of 235,000 people per annum from overseas. That's our long-term assumption, and it's in line with what was published in the Intergenerational Report and other credible sources like the Centre for Population's longer-term forecasts. So that's the work that we've done to set the national, I guess, constraint or total target for the nation's growth. Let's look at how that impacts South Australia. So we forecast the state will receive just under 4.5% of Australia's total forecast growth, which works out as just over 400,000 people over the next 25 years. This will see the state grow from about 1.8 million at the last census to just over 2.2 million by 2046, an average annual growth rate of 0.81%, which is lower than the national average. If you're wondering what drives population growth in the state, back in the 80s, the main driver of growth was people having babies, what we call natural increase. But this has been steadily declining since then, which is a symptom of the state's ageing population. In the mid to late noughties, the state enjoyed a share of the sharp rise in overseas migration to Australia that we mentioned before. But down here at the state level, interstate migration becomes a factor. And the blue line you can see there, that's a really important part of how South Australia functions demographically. So while the state typically loses population to other states in most years, as you can see, it's quite a cyclical pattern. During the pandemic, we did see a return to modest net gains from interstate, but as was the case with a lot of areas that function in this way during the pandemic, that was more of a pause to regular programming. And what we've seen since is the state returned to more traditional demographic patterns, where it's once again losing population, particularly young people, to other states. Just to look at that in the context of a personal case study that we can share, our founder, Ivan Motley, from a proud Port Adelaide family, he left South Australia in his early 20s after he completed his early education and had an early career in Adelaide, and he wasn't alone. So thousands of others have since followed that same pattern. The census question, where did you live 5 years ago, gives us data on age-specific migration flows between places. And the chart that you can see here shows that in between 2016 and 2021, so the most recent intercensal period, you can see significant numbers of young people in net terms going to other states. In fact, between those two censuses, Greater Adelaide, it suffered net losses of 20 to 30-year-olds to every capital city except Hobart and Darwin. So then let's come down another level. If we're forecasting 400,000 people will be added to South Australia in the next 25 years, which part of the state is going to get them? So the next step in the process is to look at how it's shared between the regions that make up the state, or SA4s, if you're familiar with the statistical geography. So just at a high level, the state's divided into 7 of those regions. Most of the population is concentrated, as you might expect, in the 4 regions at the top there that make up Greater Adelaide, which is home to 1.4 million people, or just under 80% of the state's population. Then there are the 3 regions that make up the rest of South Australia. We're just going to go through a quick run through of what's happening in each. So starting with Adelaide North, which we've already said forecast to be the dominant growth region for South Australia, with 146,000 people, or 40% of the state's total forecast growth expected here in the next 25 years. So this growth is driven primarily by the capacity for greenfield development. As the regions, it's not limited by geography, as is the case in the south. So places like Virginia, Manapara West, Anglevale and Gawler, they're all forecast to add significant levels of both housing and population. Adelaide West, it's a smaller region right beside the CBD. The two big stories here are firstly growth in Port Adelaide, driven by Renewal SA's Our Port project, and in the High Marsh, where the old Gasworks industrial site is being redeveloped for higher density. Adelaide Central and the Hills combines 4 quite distinct areas, just in terms of role and function of places. So it includes a bit of the Adelaide CBD, the leafy eastern suburbs, the Adelaide Hills, and then within that area, Mount Barker, which is a growth hotspot with an established housing market for young families. And as you can see, that accounts for a significant share of the forecast growth in this region. Within the CBD, it's been interesting when we produce these forecasts to note an increase in dwellings in recent years. So just to dive into that a bit more, between 2011 and 2016, we saw 724 dwellings added in the CBD. Between 16 and 21, this rose to 2,500. So that's a really significant increase. And we've not forecast that rate of growth will be maintained, but rather we expect it will settle back down to around 1,200 additional dwellings in the next 5-year period. It's worth noting as well that as we're in 2023, our forecasts are built from the 2021 census as a base year. So we actually have 2 years of new information, which certainly informed our view of how these patterns play out in the short term. The role of infills, obviously also really significant in this region. When reviewing rates of subdivision in Paradise Newton, it's very common to see one block turn into 5 dwellings. Therefore, where we have zoning that permits it and the bigger block sizes that are big enough to subdivide, we've forecast relatively high infill rates within this region. Down in the south, that's where most of Adelaide's greenfield growth happened in the 70s and the 80s and the 90s. So as a result, the growth in this area is more evenly spread throughout the region, with hotspots like Aldinga and the Hackam-Onkaparinga Hills area, where a recently rezoned urban growth area has created capacity for another 2,000 dwellings, which we forecast will be used a bit later on in the forecast period as other sources of supply in the region are filled up. Then, as I mentioned, there are the 3 regions that make up the rest of South Australia. Barossa York Mid-North, very much a retirement age population on the York Peninsula. And as it includes some of the Barossa Valley, it gets a bit of overspill from Northern Adelaide. The southeast is also heavily influenced by people moving to enjoy retirement in places like Victor Harbour and Kangaroo Island. Beautiful lifestyle regions. So we're keeping an eye on the work from home phenomenon, but it's not a significant trend at this point in time. The outback, obviously a vast area, extremely low population density, and it doesn't contribute a great deal to the overall story of where growth is happening across the state. So just pausing to say, how is it that we make these decisions about how do we decide what share of growth goes to each of these regions? And part of the stories we're looking at here is where there's capacity for growth. So in the geography, and in particular the topography of places, that will influence where you can build and develop in most cities. This topographical map shows that in Adelaide, you don't have to go too far, with the Mount Lofty Ranges right there, creating a natural barrier to greenfield growth, just 7 k's southeast of the CBD. So that puts a natural constraint on further development that side of the ranges. But another way that we look at this more from a demographic perspective is what we call the role and function of places. And this chart here might take a little bit to digest, but it's one of my personal favourites as far as it talks to the role and function of places. It tells quite an interesting story. So it shows what drives population growth in each region of South Australia. And as you can see, in most cases, those drivers of change are quite different in each region. So the 4 regions of Greater Adelaide, the Central Hills, North, South and West, they function in a way that's typical of a greater capital city, in that they attract high numbers of students and skilled workers from overseas. So that's the yellow bar there, the net overseas migration. Adelaide North is a growth area, home to lots of young families. That means lots of babies, which is why natural increase, which is the net of births and deaths, is a more significant driver of growth here than it is in any other part. You can see that there. By comparison, the three regions just outside of Greater Adelaide, they've got ageing populations, so natural increase is somewhat negligible. In the case of Barossa, York, Mid-North, there's actually more people dying there than are being born. Adelaide North, West and South have all got net intrastate losses. So that's people, that's the dark blue there, that's people moving to other parts of the state. So this is a retirement phenomenon. And you can see those people turning up in the retirement destinations of Barossa, York, Mid-North, and the Southeast region, which includes places like we mentioned, like Victor Harbor. So by understanding these different drivers of population change in each region of the state, we're better placed as forecasters to understand what the share of growth is that will go to each region and how that's shared between the regions, as well as the age structure of the people in those places. So just in this last section, I'm just going to give an overview of the local area work. So we've gone national, state, regional. We'll get into the really local area work that we do. So this is our niche at ID. Generally, we're small area focused, but particularly in the forecasting team, this is where all the planning and the investment decisions, they really rely on a local level of detail. So this is where we do our most valuable work. It's also the point where we start charging for our work. So all of those write-ups that I mentioned, they share a lot of our thinking and our actual forecasts at a regional level, but for the local forecast information, that they are paid options that we can speak to you more about in a moment. But just to illustrate the difference between our local area forecasts and those you may get from other sources, such as the state government, which are typically output at SA2 geography. This animation uses real forecast data for the Adelaide North region. This is our forecasts. On the left, it's presented as an SA2. So as I said, this is what you would get from the state government. On the right, this is the same forecasts, but at a microgeography presentation. As you can see, it's a lot more granular view of where growth is forecast to occur. And it really highlights the danger of making broad brush assumptions about what's happening within a given area. So how do we do that? How do we get such a granular view? To generate these really precise forecasts for local areas, what we have to do is align the forecast population with available sources of housing. So to do that, we undertake a really thorough audit of all current and future housing stock. This is a key part of our research process. It's quite labour intensive, it's quite time consuming, it's quite laborious if you think about different planning schemes, different developer websites, different sources of development across all the different parts of Australia. It's a very time consuming but a very important process to give that level of detail. So we get data, as I said, from various sources, what developers are advertising, satellite imagery, construction data, planning information from the councils that we work with, and of course, structured plans and planning documents from other sources. We've got a really detailed video that takes you through that process. I'll also include a link in the pack that we send around if you're interested to learn more about the process that we go through. But what this approach gives us is a comprehensive view of current and potential housing supply across Australia. But the really important thing is that, as everyone knows, not all of those planned developments will come to fruition. So it's really important that we match that forecast housing supply with the forecast population demand. What that gives us is a forecast that balances the two things. It considers developments that are happening within your LGA or your region, but also other sources of supply within your region and beyond it. So that, again, it comes back to giving you local insights about the future of population and housing in your area that consider their role in the wider regional and the national context. So here's just an example of what that looks like when that land use research is done. So this map shows all the major development sites with 10 or more dwellings. that we've identified in the Adelaide North region. And if you look closely there, you can see that they're color-coded using these identifiers in the legend. So the yellow sites, for example, they're things that are under construction. Light purple is currently being marketed, and the red are sources of supply that are indicated by structure plans and the like. So this information helps us forecast not just the location and the capacity of these developments, but also the timing and the sequence of these future developments so that we can make decisions about which ones are likely to come online and when, based on what we know about overall demand coming from population growth. But we always make the point as forecasters that growth is just one part of the story. And just because a place is growing, it doesn't mean that it isn't changing. So we'll share this example of school planning, but of course this relates to planning for any age-specific services. And of course, council provide many of those age-specific services. But the classic example in school planning is schools not being able to cater for the population growth in their area, and equally of schools being closed due to declining enrolments. So this is where there's a fundamental and a very important distinction between projections and forecasts. So projections, they make the assumption that what's happening today will happen again tomorrow. However, that approach, it doesn't account for the cyclical nature of how suburbs change and evolve. And what you'll see is that young families will move to an area, they will raise their children, and when they move out, they become empty nesters. When the kids are gone, you've got the empty nesters in that household. We call this aging in place. But when the time comes that couple look to downsize to something more appropriate, that house is often occupied by a new young family, and the cycle continues. So besides when and where places are changing, the other question that our forecasts answer is how old are these people? So this heat map here, it shows the forecast change in the secondary school age population over the forecast period for Adelaide West. The blue areas are areas of decline, so where the student age population will decline in that time, and the red areas where we're expecting significant growth in the 12 to 17-year-old cohort. So when you overlay this analysis with the location of schools, you can quickly see that there'll be less demand for schools in the south of this region and more demand around the Port Adelaide growth area. So that's how we put the forecast together, and that's the broad overview of the story that they tell for South Australia currently. In terms of how they can be accessed for people in local government, there's two ways that our local government clients access the forecasts. The first is Forecast ID, and as I've mentioned already, it's part of that suite of tools that we provide for local government. So Forecast ID, it gives your council the confidence to plan for the future with a single scenario forecast of population, housing that uses local insights in that proven and transparent national forecasting model. We have more than 130 councils who are currently using Forecast ID to inform their decision-making, policies, advocacy, and planning. There's a lot of information on this slide, and we'll send the pack around with links about how Forecast ID supports councils. But the one point that I'd like to call out is it supports many different functions across council with a single consistent evidence base. So the flexibility of the forecast geography and the independent and the credible nature of the forecasts means that they can support that range of teams from community services to planning, grant applications, and advocacy and engagement strategies. And if you've joined some of the other sessions with Sally and Jake, you may be across this already. The really exciting new feature that we're sharing today is a new service for local government called Forecast ID Catchments. So Forecast ID Catchments, it's an optional add-on that we can add to your current subscription, and it's available right now. We do feel it's a game changer for local government to be able to more effectively plan, as I said, both within and beyond your LGA boundaries, enabling you to do things like looking at the timing and the sequencing of growth and development across the LGA, like we saw in those development site examples, but also just to see the information beyond that artificial and administrative boundary of a local government area and effectively plan using catchments that extend beyond your border. For example, planning sporting facilities, assessing the appropriate upgrade of community health facilities across those areas that you share with your neighbours. We had a client in Victoria say to us recently, this is great because bushfires just don't, they don't recognise LGA boundaries. And of course, that work to have emergency preparedness plans in place is coordinated across the region. And it's really helpful to understand what share of growth a given region has, a given LGA has within the broader region. So with catchments, there's unlimited access to that to build custom catchments to assess future demand for services and infrastructure for any age group, any time period, and any bespoke catchment within your forecast area. If you are interested in working with catchments, what I'd recommend is Sally and Jake and Hamish are going to be down there next week. Just make a time to speak with them, whether it's in person or on a call, just to get a quick demo of the tool and how it works. And they'll take you through the way that we select the geographies, the way that we can select the different outputs of that report, and how you can instantly just access that really rich and detailed information for custom areas. So coming this afternoon in the information pack we're going to send around, there'll be a way that you can book a meeting if you do want to catch up with Sally, Jake and Hamish when they're in South Australia next week. We'll be sending this pack out to everybody who's registered. We'll include presentation slides, copy of the recording, as well as links to a page where you can register to be notified if you want to be notified when we publish updated forecasts for South Australia or other places in Australia. And if you'd like to share what we've presented today with other colleagues, there'll be a link to a page with all of these resources on there. So without further ado, that's a good time to just pass over to the Q&A and open up for the Q&A. And thanks again to everyone who's submitted questions, whether it's through the chat or previously when you were registering for the session. Just to introduce a couple of colleagues that have just come on screen here. We've got Johnny and Sally. So Johnny Barnard's our lead population forecaster. He's one of the founding members of ID. He's had a long involvement with ID and particularly our local government and our work with the private sector and our industry clients. Johnny's role is essentially to bring together all of the research that we do about areas to produce the forecast that we do on our roadmap. And Sally's a location strategy consultant. Sally's got really deep experience with spatial analysis and demographics, and she's also worked across both our local government and industry sides of our forecasting work. So really well placed to answer your questions. I'm just going to stop sharing so I can bring up some of the questions that have come through. Just bear with me one moment while I do that.
And feel free, as we're answering some of these that have been sent in already, the Q&A and the chat's open. So yeah, please feel free to pop any questions in there as well.
Thanks, Sal. Did you happen to have that in front of you? I've just lost that page. If you can just do the first one.
Thank you. There's one that's just come in the chat. Why don't we start there? Hi, Glenn. For the regional level forecast, how often do you update the information used, i.e. rezonings, compared to individual council area forecasts? That sounds like a classic question, Johnny.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so when we prepare states SA4 forecasts, our site work is quite a critical input to that. So that provides the basis for capacities for areas. Many areas, of course, probably have more demand than supply. So getting a good handle on how much development capacity there is in different SA4s is critical to how we go about that distribution of state forecasts down to regional forecasts. At this stage, we haven't got a set time on when we'll be going through that process next. But yeah, we continually we're looking to sort of monitor forecasts, particularly around rezonings, that we think will actually have an impact on the forecasts rather than ones that we don't think will have a huge impact on regional forecasts. So.
It's worth mentioning there too, Glenn, that in order to do our small area forecast and the forecast we do for council, we have to look at that regional level. So it sort of starts at that national level, state level, regional level, and then it cascades down to smaller and smaller geographies. And so that regional context is really important for developing the small area forecasts. And we regularly monitor the forecast. So looking at how are our forecasts tracking? Are there any things that have changed that will materially impact the population outlook for an area? If there are, a major rezoning would definitely be something that would change the outlook for an area. So then that region, that local government area would be put down as needing revision. And then this national forecasting model allows us to really regularly revise our forecast and ensure that the forecasts that you're using are indeed fit for purpose. Hopefully that answered your question, but feel free to let us know if it didn't.
I was going to say the same, Sal. Glenn, I'm just interested to know if you could maybe come back to us in the chat or send us a note afterwards. A couple of things. If there's a particular development that you wanted to share as an example of that, if there was one particular rezoning that you had in mind, and the scale of that, it'd be good to understand. But also, just from the tone of your question, I wasn't quite sure. You just said, do you update the information used compared to the individual council area forecasts? And I just wanted to be really, really clear that there is no distinction between the information that and the development of the forecast for forecast ID that goes to councils and the national forecast that are shared regionally and with our industry partners. They are one set of forecasts. There's no distinction between those. So the evidence base that you're using is exactly the same evidence base that's used by people planning, Catholic Education Office planning, schools in the area. So just wanted to check we were really clear on that point too. Yeah, please come back to us in the chat if you want to follow on with that one. Thanks, Al. I've got the questions up here now. The next question was, to what extent is your data able to be disaggregated? For example, I live in Victor Harbor, and I presume the statewide data can be disaggregated by local government area. But what about locations such as Back Valley, which is a smaller area within the LGA? I feel like we've covered that a bit, but Johnny, do you just want to sort of reiterate that point?
Yeah, I should say that we don't, it's not statewide data in the sense it's not state population forecast. We're disaggregating down to a smaller geography. It's our own independent set of forecasts as well. In terms of the geography they're prepared at, we go down as far down as SA1. So quite a small area of geography. If it's a major growth area, then it's broken up into sub SA1 areas. So major growth fronts, particularly North Adelaide, will have many of our small SAPI geographies within an SA1. But for established areas, it's down to SA1. So I can't speak for Back Valley specifically. It may be a sub SA1. I'm not sure we'd be able to necessarily define that locality, but we'd probably have at least SA1 in that area.
Thanks, JB. The next one was particularly around the Concordia growth area, that it's been publicly announced by the state government as an area to help ease the pressure on SA's housing supply. And based off the maps that you shared earlier, I believe you only had population growth in this area from 2036. Is this the type of time frame that you see development commencing in this area? Johnny.
Interesting one. Yeah, look, those longer term areas that have been identified for growth, we basically make a call on where competing land areas are. That is probably a more fluid part of forecasts. Obviously in Northern Adelaide, we have still a lot of land around Angle Vale. We have the Riverlea development. Playton in general has quite a bit of land left. So that is just sort of based on best estimates at the moment of the order of development and how long it takes to get infrastructure in and rezoning and planning done for these sorts of places. But that's not to suggest that when we review that area, that those things can change. If planning, policy work is done, if infrastructure is enabled to these sorts of places, then they can come forward in our pecking order. And in somewhere like Adelaide North, if it came on earlier, it might slow down our assumptions in somewhere like Angle Vale. So it's a sort of juggling act based on our assumed levels of demand in these areas and where each of these sites or precincts are at in terms of their planning and infrastructure provision. But I should say these are certainly things that local government can get involved with in terms of providing us with information on what they see as timing and what they see as potential impediments to particular areas developing based on infrastructure constraints. All that information absolutely we will take account of in feeding back into our forecast.
Leading on from that, Glenn's come back to us in the chat regarding the earlier question that he put to us about the rezonings, and just to read that out, I noticed that the renewal SA rezoning of the West End Brewery site was not included. This rezoning will deliver 1,000 new dwellings, 20% affordable, with development proposed to start 2025-ish. This will affect the school slide that we had at the end of the presentation. I assume that's a similar thing, Johnny, where it's as new information comes to hand, we make a judgment call as to how that plays with other sources of supply across the region.
Yeah, absolutely. Somewhere like in that part of the world, we would probably assume there is demand for a significant majority of that site to happen in the short term. So, we do get rezonings as well in areas where we probably assess that demand isn't necessarily there. But off the top of my head, that would probably be an area that we will take into account when we update our forecastings.
And Glenn, I know we're coming out to see you next week, so I'll have a look a bit more into our assumptions around that so we can give you a more thorough answer when we meet next week.
I should just say that the assumptions in the DEVLO are not just based on known sites. So we do assume that certain percentages of activity centre zones, areas that are upzoned along main roads, transport corridors, a certain proportion of those areas will provide dwellings over the forecast period. So they don't necessarily have to be sites that we know about have been approved or flagged at this point. So there are other sources of development we take into account.
Might change pace a little bit, maybe not. Just say the common question that's really good to address is how accurate are the forecasts? And Sal, can I put that one to you?
Sure. You know what? It always seems like such a simple question to answer, and it's not like I'm trying to be evasive here, but it's a really tricky one to answer because forecasts, it depends what you're comparing to. Forecasts can be very accurate at a total population level, but you might not have the age structure right. Or it could be good at, some geographies are not so good at others. So it's actually something that's really quite tricky to measure. So there's sort of probably three important things that you need to consider when looking at the accuracy of forecasts. So the first is the quality of the assumptions that go into the forecast. Forecasts are only as good as the information you put in. And so we try to have complete transparency over those assumptions, including, what's that residential development pipeline? What have we included? What haven't we included? So even if we may have, something might have changed and, there's a new site that we think is going to come online, at least what is and isn't included in our forecasts. Our forecasting methodology also means that we have to actually ground truth our forecast, because we're not just sort of cascading forecasts down from a national level. You actually have to have houses where people can live in order to grow that population. The other important factor is monitoring of the forecast. So we have a set of thresholds in place, and if there's a change in something that will materially impact the forecast outlook for an area, so things like that major rezoning development occurring at a faster rate than anticipated, we'll alert our clients and we prioritise that area for an update. And the other thing is that, you have to look at the quality of the people producing the forecast, and the ability to decipher, what are long-term trends, what are blips. And certainly we've got a group of people that you've been doing it for at ID for 25 years now.
I think someone said recently we've got 75 years of experience between Johnny and John O'Leary and Richard combined. So there's
Yeah, I think in a very simplistic way, the last time we sort of assessed it at a local government area level, we were more accurate than state government in, more than 2/3 of cases. There's a very high level indication, but yeah, more than happy to elaborate further if you want me to keep rambling about it.
No, I think that's a the most accurate and honest answer that we can provide to the question, and key is transparency with all of these things. Is it worth saying as well that we take a very evidence-based approach to the way that we do our forecasts, and if there's a spectrum between kind of like pure, here's what we wait and see till it happens and then tell us it's happened, and complete crystal ball gazing, we are waiting for material evidence of certain things. So the example that came out in recent webinar was we were talking to some people in Tasmania, and they've got massive programs happening to try and keep more of their young people, similar to what South Australia are working on. They've got a Department of State Growth, lots of initiatives and a lot of investment being put into those programs. The facts of what we're seeing, the evidence is that they're losing young people to the mainland capitals in similar cohorts to what we were seeing in SA. So as demographers, we have to reflect those patterns in the forecasts, and essentially we're waiting for evidence of those well-established demographic patterns changing before we'd reflect that in the forecasts. Is that fair summary, Johnny? Any colour?
It is. Yeah, I was just going to add that. The logic behind the forecast is that you can kind of understand the steps of where we get to from having a top-down forecast to allocating it down to our bottom level, looking at our dev sites. So there's transparency around those assumptions as to how we've come about our state and territory forecasts and how we've come about regional forecasts and so on. So and doing forecasts at this level of geography means there's sort of nowhere to hide really in terms of where you put people. You can only put people where there's potential for new dwellings to be constructed. So that gives it that sort of rigor from that perspective as well. But in terms of overall accuracy, we've been in this game for a while, and one of the big input is net overseas migration, really, to wherever you're doing forecasts in Australia. And if we were doing forecasts from 10, 15 years ago, look very low because we've obviously had a lot more net overseas migration than what we thought we were going to have at a sort of macro scale. So all we can do is have our best crack at speaking to as many people as we can to get those sort of big picture assumptions as right as possible.
And then I guess at the local area level, it's also the input we get from you, Council. So as part of this new national forecasting program, we've got methodologies and processes to collect all of that local information ourselves, but it is certainly enriched when we work with you as well. So we've got processes to gather that local information that's on the ground and help to feed that within our forecasts as well. And working with, a lot of the major utilities and things across the country, developers, retailers as well, getting information from what they're seeing in their work. So we sort of feel like we've got this big network of organisations who are all involved in understanding settlement patterns and building our communities. So, pulling all that information together is a really important part of the process as well.
We did have some other questions that have been submitted previously when people were interested in what's happening in South Australia, but I'm sort of reticent to go too far off topic today. I'd really be interested to know if we've got time, if there's other questions that you had, particularly from a local government perspective. Raise your hand, pop them in the chat. Just want to make sure we keep it really relevant to what you're interested in.
And also, if you obviously think of any questions after the session too, you're more than welcome to get in touch.
It's going to give that a minute.
We give people some time back in the day, which is always
yeah. Look, we might hang around for another couple of minutes, but just might wrap up at that point. As I said, if you ask any questions, we'll certainly can stick around and discuss those. But Sally's going to be in SA, as I mentioned, next week. Make a time for Jake or herself, Hamish, to come through and catch up. We'd really love to talk you through what we've presented today, and particularly the catchment tool. We really think that there's a great opportunity for councils to use that tool to delve a bit deeper than what's been possible in the past with Forecast ID. So please, if you're interested in that, we get the email this afternoon with the links to all the resources. Just hit reply to that email. That'll come straight to us, and we can certainly follow up and make a time that works for you, whether that's in person or on a call. If there weren't any further questions, we might wrap it there. But thanks again for making the time to spend an hour with us. And yeah, we'll look forward to hearing from you soon.
Yeah, look forward to seeing you, a number of you over in Adelaide next week. Looking forward to our trip.
Cool. Thanks again.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks
Bye.
all.
Cheers.
Bye.
Bye-bye.